Lasker-Schüler and Max Czollek. How do you pronounce his last name, Simone? Czollek? Czollek. I'm Allison Schachter. I'm the chair of what is now the Department of Jewish Studies. And I just want to thank the German department for co-sponsoring this event. It's a really nice meeting point of the work we do in the Jewish Studies program and our connections with German, Russian, and East European studies. So thanks, Lutz. We're really lucky today to have a conversation between three really wonderful scholars that are working on the intersections of German and Hebrew, and I'm excited to bring them together. And I'm sad that we can't all be together in person, but one of the lovely things about Zoom is that it also does allow us to bring people from all over. And I think of Simone, Nama, and Maya as in some ways as the Bay Area crew, but here we are in Nashville with Chicago and Israel and Ann Arbor present. So what I'll do is introduce our three speakers. I think I will start with introductions, and then they'll each speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And I may open it with a first question, but we're really interested in having this be a dialogic discussion about the questions raised between Correspondences in Hebrew and Yiddish. So the first speaker today, I'm delighted to introduce Naama Rokem, who teaches in the departments of Comparative Literature and Near Eastern Languages at the University of Chicago, where she also directs the Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies. She works on Hebrew and German Jewish literature and is particularly interested in language mixing and self-translation, and is working on some projects towards the future on this. But her book, Prosaic Conditions, Heinrich Heine and the Spaces of Zionist Literature, was published in 2013 by Northwestern University Press. And if you have interest in it, it's a really wonderful book. I highly recommend it. Maya Barzilai is Associate Professor of Hebrew and Jewish Cultures at the University of Michigan. She's currently co-head fellow of the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies, which focuses this year on the theme of translating Jewish cultures. And there have been a lot of wonderful events and continue to be. So if you're interested, go check out the Frankel Center website. Her first book, which is also fabulous and I highly recommend, is called Golem: Modern Wars and Their Monsters, and appeared with NYU Press in 2016. Her current project explores the intersections of affect theory and translation studies through 20th century German Hebrew literary dialogues. And our final speaker, who's familiar to many of you, is Simone Sterner, an assistant professor of German at Vanderbilt. And her areas of research include poetry and poetics, critical theory, German Hebrew literary encounters, and memory studies. Her work has been published in New Literary History and Q Parl. And I was an editor in Q Parl many years ago at Berkeley, so it's nice to see. Her current book project examines forms of care and attention in poetry after the Holocaust, and reads works by Paul Celan alongside Charlotte Delbo, Dawn Pagis, Mai Aim, and Max Czollek. And she received her PhD in Comp Lit from Berkeley in 2020. So we'll begin now with Naama's talk.
Yes, thank you, Allison, and thank you for setting up the conversation, and thank you all for being here. It's nice to see sort of people from all over in various contexts. I thought that sort of since the invitation from Allison was really to sort of think about between the three of us, kind of the shape of this conversation right now around German Hebrew studies, the German Hebrew conversation, German Hebrew correspondences. I thought that I would start with some brief but fairly broad comments about the context for our conversation, just kind of to bring everyone to the same page, as it were. You know, as I see some of the people who are here are active participants in this conversation, and probably could talk about it more so than me. But I guess just to kind of present and give a picture of the work and collaboration that's been going on for about 15 years now, or so, at the intersection of German and Hebrew cultures, and has been growing into a kind of distinct subfield I want to propose. And then I'll say a few words about the way that letters and correspondences in the title of today's conversation, it can work kind of metaphorically, but actually to speak concretely about the way that letters and correspondences have increasingly become a focal point of my engagement with this field. And I think it's something that, I know that it's something that Maya and I have talked about a lot, and I think you'll hear about it from her as well today. And then I'll end briefly with an example from the kind of broader project that I'm developing around this issue of kind of letters, the German Hebrew letter, as it were. So the one example of Lasker-Schüler. So in some sense, the question is, why does this particular intersection between German and Hebrew require particular attention? Right, any two languages could make up a pairing, and why is there sort of a sense that there's a particular shape and urgency to that pairing and that conversation? What makes the intersection between German and Hebrew distinct? Or a way to pose the question would be, what makes the intersection between German and Hebrew distinct, and also what makes it broadly instructive, right? On the one hand, in what sense does it have particular kind of issues and stakes that require kind of setting it off and thinking of it as a subfield in its own right? And on the other hand, precisely the point of having this conversation perhaps is what it shows. And you can think of that second part of the question, both in terms of the place of this subfield within Jewish studies, right? What does this within the broader, especially Jewish literary studies and modern Jewish literary studies, which is a multilingual field by definition, and which in important fundamental ways is shaped by sort of the Jewish diglossia, heteroglossia around Hebrew and Yiddish in its European kind of subfield. So what does the German Hebrew conversation have to provide to that field in particular? But then also within kind of the field of comparative literature, where bilingual writing and language mixture is becoming increasingly sort of a conversation in its own right. What does the German Hebrew, the case of German Hebrew bilingualism, what does it have to give to that field? And I won't really address either of those questions, but I'm sort of putting it out there at the outset. So what I want to propose is kind of a very general background comment, is that you get a sense of the outline of this particular field or this particular question, and some of precisely its stakes by thinking about the issue of time frame, right? By thinking about when and the periodization and time frame of this cultural conversation or this form of cultural production. So in very broad strokes, an important kind of element or an important group of texts and authors that are very central to this conversation are a whole sort of generation of post-war authors who are in different senses survivors of the European catastrophe and who negotiate between the language of the perpetrator and the language of the victim in some sense. Right, many of them writing in an Israeli context that shunned Germany and the German language, which was their first language. And in a context where precisely Israel and Hebrew were held up as symbols of survival and overcoming. So some of the authors that I've written about from that group are people like Yehuda Amichai or Dan Pagis, and of course Paul Celan, who both Maya and Simone will refer to today, doesn't belong to the same group, right? He's also a post-war author who's writing in relation to the kind of presence of, or writing in German, but with dialogue with Hebrew, but precisely not within this Israeli context, within which other authors like Talmog, Pagis, Appelfeld, many others are negotiating German and Hebrew. The generation or so before that, during the early decades of the 20th century, during that period, there were many important Hebrew authors who lived and worked in German cities such as Berlin, Vienna, Bad Homburg, and this significantly shaped their work. And at the same time, there were German Jewish authors who engaged with Hebrew in different ways. Right, you can think of Kafka's Hebrew lessons, the Kafka Hebrew notebooks, which are sort of have become were part of the archive that was under legal dispute recently, and are a really interesting object to think about. Or something like Lasker-Schüler's famous statement that her poetry did not require translation into Hebrew because her poems were already in that language, right? The poems that she wrote in German. And I would point out that during this period of these early decades of the 20th century, both German and Hebrew are languages whose cultural meaning exceeds the community of people who speak and write them as their first language or their strongest language or even their main language, right? That it's a moment in which both Hebrew and German have a strong symbolic and political pull that is very significant for thinking about this cultural intersection, right? Hebrew, a language with both religious and increasingly in that period, nationalist significance. And for many Jews in East and Central Europe, German at that moment was seen as a language of European culture, the language of European culture in many ways, and also very much as the language of politics, right? So even Zionist politics was pursued mostly through German in that moment. And there was sort of this broad idea that really politics and nationalist politics could be pursued primarily in German. It's Mark Wulovici has recently written really interestingly precisely about that. And then going back even further, you can think of kind of the origins or the kind of the broader context of the whole thing. You can think of Haskalah figures like Moses Mendelssohn, for whom authorship in the two languages and translation between them in itself embodied the very idea of Jewish enlightenment, right? The possibility of Jewish enlightenment had to do with somehow being able to produce and to translate between the two languages. So I offer these time markers, as I said, as sort of contours for thinking about the long history of German-Hebrew exchanges and correspondences. And, you know, as a kind of polemical move or as a kind of provocative point, one might even think of Martin Luther and his inauguration of modern Jewish literature, modern German literature, with the translation from Hebrew as the kind of father of the field, right? But that would be a problematic framing, of course, but maybe one that produces conversation. In any case, through these different periods, thinking about German and Hebrew in conversation provides really interesting opportunities for thinking about multilingual authorship, writing in multilingual contexts, kind of the politics of and stakes of translation, practices of language mixing, self-translation, and the various dialogues that exist around translation and adaptation. And one line of thought that I've been particularly interested in is the form of interruption that is constituted by the appearance of a word or a phrase or even a passage in one language within a text in the other language, right? So something like the bilingual drafts and notes that Amichai writes and keeps in his archive, or poems by Celan that integrate single Hebrew words, or say Else Lasker-Schüler's half-invented Hebrew that shows up in as an interruption in various contexts. And some of the questions that come up when we think of switching between these two particular languages are, right, when does it involve mixing scripts, which in this case also involves changing direction, right? So if you write in German and Hebrew on one page, that involves also not only the mixture of scripts, but also the mixtures of directions of writing and reading. How, in cases where there isn't a mix of scripts, how does transcription work? And there's a kind of really interesting, very deep imbalance between German and Hebrew in the kind of practices of transcription, because transcribing German words in Hebrew has a very rich, kind of deep historical, there's a lot of history to it, and it relates to the presence of Yiddish as well. But there's not so much kind of a practice of the other way around is very different, I would say, right? Transcribing Hebrew and German, that's something else. So I think we can ask what kinds of meaning is produced in transcription, and beyond that, who is the audience for a text that mixes German and Hebrew, and how is it meant to be read, right? So what is the poetics of this form of linguistic interruption? So I'll skip a little bit because I'm realizing I'm running out of time, but I'll say that in relation to various questions that come up in this context, I've come to think of the letter as a genre that really mediates a lot of the issues that come up when you try to think about bilingual and multilingual writing, right? It's an ego document that functions to give the interlocutor a glimpse into the inner world of the letter writer, including their linguistic makeup, so to speak. But it's also a kind of conversational genre that maybe gives us a kind of glimpse into a sociolinguistic reality where language mixture is practiced. And finally, it's also a literary text where the tension between languages can accrue poetic meaning. So do I have time, Alison, to show like just a couple of images?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure, I'll just show, just to kind of share, as I said, this is kind of, how do I, well, I'll just leave it like this. That in Lasker-Schüler's practice, all of these elements mix, language mixture, that the letter is genre. She's is the author of two epistolary novels that really blur kind of the borders between the autobiographical and the fictional, and her letters are sort of these sites of various kinds of mixture and interruption, right? Famously, word and image very often mix on the page, or also sort of even word and physical object that becomes a kind of interruption of the textual nature of the letter. This is a letter that she wrote to the Hebrew poet Wolfgang Greenberg, in which we begin to see, right, her practices even of spelling out without quite knowing a Hebrew word. This is supposed to be shalom, right? And that somehow the Hebrew letter and the visual image, in this case, the Star of David, right, are related in her practice. So that leads all the way to kind of late moments. I don't know how well you can see this on your screens, but these are some of the last letters in her voluminous correspondence, written in 1940 in Jerusalem, not long before she died, that are filled with things like, right, she writes to David Ben Senator, a scholar at the Hebrew University, and calls him Adon, and even in one case, right, dear Adon. So we really get also a kind of, again, this kind of socio-linguistic flavor of life in British Mandate Jerusalem, that where English and Hebrew are both present, but also, of course, her Hebrew. So I'm trying to think through precisely this transcription mixture, the life lived between languages, but also a kind of poetics of language mixture that has is a long-standing practice for someone like Lasker-Schüler. Thank you.
Thanks, Nama. So our next speaker is Maya Barzilai.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nama, for setting the stage and kind of opening a lot of the questions that we'll deal with today, and Alison for bringing us all together. It's really fun to be in this part of this dialogue. I'm going to share, one second. Sorry. Hold on. That is weird. One second. I'll get it up. Okay. Oh, maybe that's why. Yes. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to share a short example from my current project that concerns German Hebrew exchange, and it really touches on some of the themes that have already come up, as you see at the end of this letter written from Paul Celan to a poet that I'll talk about today, David Rokem. You can see Shana Tova misspelled, but in Hebrew by Paul Celan and Alles Gute. So I want to say that a good portion of the work in German Hebrew studies really takes place in archives, drawing on unpublished literary drafts, translations, or self-translations, as well as letter exchanges. And I want to ponder about that and talk about the specific reason for this archival fever has to do with things that Nama has raised. In other words, that German Hebrew relations often took place outside of the public view in covert forms and personal exchanges, maybe in writers' diaries rather, or notebooks, as in the Kafka case, rather than out in the open. So some of the Hebrew writers that I work on, in one case is Avraham ben Yitzchak, who was an early 20th century modernist poet. They wrote extensively in German, but because of the turn to Hebrew and the importance of Hebrew for their nationalist agenda, they were often engaged in cultural Zionism. They did not publish in German, they published only in Hebrew. So there's this interesting tension and split, right, between the languages, which becomes even more pronounced in the late 20th century after World War II. So my remarks today concern this archival project, and I'm happy to talk more about kind of the meaning of the archive, again, in connection to letter writing. This is the correspondence between the German poet Paul Celan and the Hebrew poet David Rokem. Interestingly, Rokem is the only modern Hebrew writer that Celan ever translated, despite his knowledge of Hebrew. And even that he did very reluctantly. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. Rokem himself also translated a few of Celan's poems, and those appeared in Hebrew language journals with approval of the poet. And while the two poets met in person several times, their main mode of communication was through letters. So a few general remarks about letters. Translation plays a central role in the letters. Rokem shared with Celan contemporary translations of the German poet's work in Hebrew and English. He also sent and received drafts of German versions to his poems. Celan also agreed to publish a few of these translations, and others appeared posthumously. We need to consider how translations might have an epistolary function. They are addressed to someone and await the poet's response and affirmation. And the epistolary translation also reveals the inadequacy of the linear model of source to target translation. We see here a kind of call and response that develops over time and space, going back and forth. So the letters travel, and with them the translations that travel back and forth between the poets. The letters reveal translation to be a negotiation of distances, both physical and linguistic, in order to attain a degree of proximity and even intimacy. So I want to just quote from a published letter, and all of these letters between Rokem and Celan were not published, to Ilana Shmueli, in which Celan says, "I was pleased perhaps at the wrong place to be able to decipher and translate a Hebrew text by David Rokem." So he also talks in that same letter about his unease about the figure or the person of Rokem, but it's clear that Celan had some kind of affect invested in this translation project. So a little bit of background just to who Rokem was, because probably Paul Celan is a little more familiar to all of you. So he was a Polish-born Hebrew poet who immigrated to Palestine in the mid-1930s. He wrote mainly in Hebrew, publishing multiple volumes of poetry. And his poetry is focused on the landscapes of Israel and tends to be very compact and static. You'll see in a minute. One critic described his poems, and I'm quoting, that in his poems, quoting, the nouns overtake or obliterate the verbs. So there's an emphasis on things and nouns. Rokem was out of sync with contemporary Israeli trends, literary trends, and he achieved acclaim instead in Germany through German translation by very notable poets. And you can see here a list of them. Rokem was the one to initiate the contact with Paul Celan originally. Oh, sorry, go back. He wrote to him in English, and Celan never responded. Then he turned again in German to write to him in German, and they began a correspondence, as I told you, that involved sharing translations. And you can see that the correspondence broke off in the early 1960s. Rokem himself claimed later on that Celan was upset because he did not give him compliments about one of his poems that he read out loud to him. But Barbara Wiedemann conjectures that the poets reached an impasse when working on a poem entitled Cheshvan, November, which I'll discuss at the end of this talk, and I tend to agree. You'll see in a moment why. Okay, and just in general, Rokem, the way he managed to produce so many volumes of his poetry in German with all these poets translating him, like Enzensberger and Sachs, was that he would transmit to them rough drafts of his poems and word lists. And you can see an example here of a word list that was written by Rokem, but all the annotations, the question marks, the addition of words are by Celan himself. This is from the Morbach archive. So Rokem basically oversaw the translation process. He gave a draft, then he oversaw the result and made sure it matched his Hebrew. But in Celan's case, this of course did not transpire in the same way, because Celan did have access to the Hebrew, and the poet often veered significantly from the draft he was sent. So let's look at one example of where that happens. So this is a 1959 poem entitled in Hebrew Ben Aviv leKaitz, in German Zwischen Frühling und Sommer, between spring and summer, and it appeared in 1959 in the New Zurich newspaper. And I'll just read the German, and you can follow in the English or Hebrew version, whichever you prefer. So this is just the opening stanza. The poem is quite a bit longer. Meine Taube dort zwischen Klippe und Klippe, die Schleusen neu voll Wasser, der Sand älter als alt, unterwegs nach wie vor zu deinen Augen. Celan added a line break between meine and Taube. You can see Yonati in Hebrew is one word, to emphasize distance and call into question the ownership of the dove, which was actually a very important image for his own early poetry, if you're familiar. He also inserted the word dot there, underscoring the space between the site of the poem and the site of translation. So all this is happening there. He multiplies words such as klippe und klippe, cliff, and älter als alt, older than old, to extend the temporal and spatial dimensions of the poem. In this manner, the sand has to travel even further to reach the eye as the poem extends vertically on the page. And to recall, the opening lines allude to the Song of Songs and the beloved as a dove in the clefts of the rock. So Celan's translation recognizes the distance between ancient Hebrew and modern German rather than collapsing it. In all these ways, the translation of the poem marks and performs the distance between Israel and France or Switzerland, between Hebrew and German. In a letter dating to September 1959, Celan wrote, and this is, I'm just going to read a passage in my English translation. As soon as your letter with the poem arrived, I tried to translate it, but I encountered difficulties. And he says, yes, I've not overcome all the difficulties. Some questions remain. But I think the version that I enclosed in this letter seems to come somewhat close to your poem. Deinem Gedicht ein wenig nahe zu kommen. Please let me know what you think. In other words, let me know the places that do not do justice to your poem. Celan's tone here is tentative. He has not overcome all the questions and difficulties, some of which are inherent to the languages. He merely came a bit closer to the Hebrew poem. But what does that mean? What does it mean to achieve this kind of proximity relative to the distances enacted in the translation? And I want to mention that in a response to Celan, 2 days later, Rokem affirmed, he said, yes, you came very close to the original. He uses the same idiom, nahe kommen, that Celan used, and he acknowledged this closeness. And he says that it was achieved even though Celan had to restructure the poem. And this is a really important point about the relationship between German and Hebrew, the restructuring. What Celan did, and you can see the rest of the letter here that you saw also in the opening, he says that he deviates from the poem in the layout of particular lines. And this was in order to convey the conciseness, lapidare, of the Hebrew. So abweichen means to deviate, but also to stray. In other words, the German translation must stray from the Hebrew poem in order to convey its sense better. And Celan's solution was actually to use, I'll show you again the poem, to use shorter lines to break the poem into short lines and have a longer poem, even though it has more words, and have kind of this vertical length of drawing the poem down on the page. So this is the poem that I mentioned in the beginning, and I'll end with it, that kind of caused the translational relationship to end. And what we have here is further deviation. So we have the first two lines in Hebrew are basically read, you gather twigs and remember your wounds. This is the poem Cheshvan, or the month of Cheshvan. So what Celan did with that is create a quatrain, a longer poem. He also added more to the poem, things like the wounds you were struck, not just your wounds, or the gathering together. He uses German verbs that you can break apart and pull together as if to enact the idea of the poem that gathers, or the speaker in the poem that gathers the wounds. And Rokem wrote to him in May of 1960 that the translation is not close enough to the original. Es soll dem Original noch etwas näher kommen. And again, we get this nakommen idiom again recurring. So now, and it's the form of an admonishment, Rokem suggested that Celan be more literal, come closer in a different way, maybe to his poem. And that's what Rokem wanted, but that's where Celan also drew the line. And that's where I see the correspondence ending. So I hope that you got a sense here a little bit of like how the letters translations interact, right? That there is, you cannot like separate the context of the letter when you try to understand these translations. I really wanted to stress the inseparability of the epistolary form and the German Hebrew translation, and say that both are attempts to cross distances, to find a meeting ground, to reach the other, to come closer, allowing the older sounds of Hebrew perhaps to wander to the German eye, but also, of course, recognizing that this is impossible and that distances do remain. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Maya. Our next speaker is Simone Sterner.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Naama and Maya. I'm so excited to be part of this event. I will say that much of my own thinking around this whole subfield of Hebrew German literary studies, correspondences, and so on, has really been shaped by the work that you all have been doing. So I'm really honored to be joining you today for this correspondence that we are somehow enacting here. So I want to contribute to our discussion around Hebrew-German correspondences by turning to the work of Max Czollek, so possibly to use Naama's term from before, adding a new time marker, so we're very contemporary. And I want to ask what his poetry that features Hebrew elements can contribute to these discussions around the Hebrew-German contact zone. Max Czollek, for those of you who are not familiar with his work, he is a German-Jewish, Berlin-based poet. You can see here on that slide just some of his poetry collections he published since 2015. He's incredibly prolific. Aside from his poetry, he's also the author of 2 recent manifesto-style essay collections that intervene in the discourse around Germany's culture of remembrance and discourses around German identity, the long legacy of the country's Nazi past, and the particular place of minorities in Germany today. He's also, at any given moment, he's engaged in a series of collaborative projects, and I chose this one image that you see on the top on the slide here, which is a recent project called the Tage der jüdisch-muslimischen Leitkultur, so maybe the days of the Jewish-Muslim hegemony. And I like that image particularly because it features, you can see in the font, the Hebrew element in there. The dialogue with Hebrew, the presence of Hebrew in Czollek's poetry is not as prominent as, for instance, the one with Yiddish. So Yiddish plays an, I would say, even more important role. And I think there's also something to be said about the relation between Yiddish and Hebrew, or the difference between them with regard to his writing. But still, Hebrew is a recurring thread in the tapestry of his poetry. There are Hebrew words like Aleph, Kaddish, Malchut. There are several Tel Aviv poems that bring us closer to the Hebrew language by way of the geographic location. There are references to Hebrew authors. One collection of poems in his 2019 volume, Grenzwerte, for instance, as you can see here, I just took a picture of the page in that collection. Is titled A Season, eine Jahreszeit, in der Amos Oz mal wieder nicht den Nobelpreis erhält. So a season in which Amos Oz doesn't receive the Nobel Prize yet again. And you can also see that he's frequently collaborating with illustrators, which is why I picked up some of the illustrations that are in his books throughout this PowerPoint. What I want to do now is to give us two brief snapshots of Hebrew-German interactions in his poetry, and then articulate some questions that arise from them and possibly come up with a hypothesis. So the first poem, and I'll read it in the German. You can follow along in the English translation by John Cho Polizzi, and I apologize for the messed up brackets. I think there's something to be said about how the whole writing in, especially, I don't know, maybe it's just my Mac, but writing in Word in Hebrew and in German is a difficult correspondence often. It tends to move things around. All right. Moshava Germanit. Ich frage mich, ob diese Stadt so Urlaubsgefühl und Abfuck in mein Reimschema passt. Immer dabei, immer daneben. Der Frühling liegt in den Wehen, ich brauche fast nichts zum Leben, bloß einen Teller Holz und kein Brot, auf dem Tisch dort Zuckersand im Bett, ein paar Schuppen, die mir der Traum gewetzt. Will sagen, ich war ganz wundgerieben von Eichen. Denke in Tüchern, wenn es heiß wird, schaue ich das Meer hinab. Es gibt hier keine Möwen, die Heimweh kreischen. So the title, Moshava Germanit, situates us in Haifa, seemingly a place of vacation for the speaker. We get a glimpse of spring, growing heat, the sea. We seem to be somewhere elsewhere. This is also supported by the fact that the title of this poem is in another language, in Hebrew. And this is really something that stands out for me here, is that Czollek, unlike, for instance, Celan, in many of the moments when he uses Hebrew words, Czollek doesn't transcribe the Hebrew, which is somewhat ironic because that which stands as foreign, quote unquote, in the poem is the German colony, Moshava Germanit, which hence inverts the structure of linguistic belonging. So the Hebrew is not only in the German poem, but the Hebrew has taken over the German colony. Czollek quite literally writes the German, Ha-Germanit, in Hebrew. And Moshava Germanit, of course, also designates the actual site of a settlement in Ottoman Haifa by the German Templars. So there's also an interesting history of geographic processes of inhabiting settling space. Moshava Germanit is also not the only German element in the poem. In the third stanza, I think the line will sagen, ich war ganz wundgerieben von Eichen, in referencing oaks, also brings to mind the Deutsche Eiche, in an image that is actually quite uncomfortable. So the speaker is worn down, grated by the oaks. When just two lines above, the only thing grating the body of the speaker seem to have been the remains of sand from a Haifa beach. So the interconnectedness of German and Hebrew is linguistic, but also tied with geography, with a place. And we can ask what happens in this contact zone, whether it is a harmonious correspondence or whether they wear each other down, leaving scabs, and what's at stake in such a poetics. One thing that I've been thinking about is also that other contemporary German poets and other contemporary multilingual German poets, we can think of, for instance, Yoko Tawada or José Oliver, they've often been described as nomadic writers. So writers crossing a borderland between different languages. And of course, and that's also a broader theme in the scholarship on multilingual writing in general. But thinking about this, I really find that Czollek, in fact, doesn't strike me as much as a nomadic writer. I find there's something in his poetry that stakes a claim and that marks a here, but then it also really leads us into the depths of this place and really has us question from within and through language, the space, linguistic, geographic, in all its complexities. I'm going to turn quickly to one other poem, and it's titled Zimtzum, 2015. And the poem maps the Kabbalistic notion of the contraction and withdrawal of God in order to create space for the creation of the universe onto an image that received global attention in 2015 namely the dead body of Alan Kurdi, a Syrian child that was swept up dead at the beach in Greece on September 2nd, 2015, an event which also really put pressure on European but also German refugee politics. Zimzum 2015. Bei der Erschaffung der Welt zerbarsten die großen Plasmabildschirme. Darum die Pixel am Strand, darum rauscht das Meer in Griechenland, hat keinen Empfang. Kann sein, das heilige Licht verteilte sich, die Steine wurden verrückt. Eine Berührung riskiert ihr Gleichgewicht. Und eine Gegend, die gerade noch aus Palmen und Bauvorhaben bestand, verdichtet sich zu einem Körper, der angespült wird über Nacht. So we have another poem with a Hebrew title, although this time not using the Hebrew letters, which also intimates that Zimzum is a Hebrew word that is also used in German. This presence of words that come from a Kabbalistic or more broadly religious vocabulary was also, of course, something that someone like Celan is very known for that. In fact, they often use some of the same words, Celan and Czollek. And it was something in a scholarship on Paul Celan's use of Hebrew. I feel like around 2000, and particularly, and I would be interested in hearing what Naama and Maya think about that, but I felt there was, especially in the German academic context, this particular strand of interpretation happening in the early 2000s that focused on Hebrew as some kind of key to understanding an otherwise obscure, difficult poem with regard to Celan. So that is to say that the knowledge of Hebrew as a linguistic or cultural code somehow allowed readers to decode an otherwise difficult poem. But that's not what seems to be happening here in Czollek, and frankly, I also don't think that this is necessarily what was happening in Celan, but it's a different topic. No matter if we understand Zimzum or not, linguistically and culturally, the poem produces an experience of Zimzum, produces an experience of the bursting apart, the sudden narrowing in on the scene, suddenly moving into focus this image of the body on the beach. So Zimzum here is not only one Hebrew word, I think, but it is really a poetic act. It's the production of perspective, which moves the death of Alan Kurdi into view. So Hebrew claims a presence, and it structures patterns of seeing and perceiving in the presence. Hebrew becomes the lens through which we see this contemporary event. And I'm just seeing that I have 2-3 more minutes. So I'm gonna show you one quote that is from Max Czollek himself in dialogue with the Yiddish Book Center, where he talks about the question what role Hebrew and Yiddish play for his identity today. And he says, connecting to a Yiddish and Hebrew tradition makes me more of a Jewish subject than I would have had to be. So I'm really not choosing the way of being invisible, but I'm kind of actively moving into that space. And if you have a space that is so much attached by fantasies and by projections of whatever has been lost, it's kind of difficult to approach those places without buying into those fantasies. But then again, I feel like the strategy I've discovered has been to seek autonomy in those spaces in order to rearrange them for myself. So back to the German-Hebrew correspondence, for me, the insight of looking at Czollek in this writing is really that his way of writing German with Hebrew, this German-Hebrew macaronics, they somehow bring him in dialogue also with poets like Celan, like Lasker-Schüler, which raises the question, I think, to what extent we might also have to think about this Hebrew-German connection in terms of intertextuality, maybe. But what I do want to propose is that by writing in German with Hebrew, Czollek establishes a poetic kinship that forms itself by way of inhabiting language and languages similarly, but it also moves into new terrain, seeking autonomy and shaping his own narrative poetically in contemporary Germany, while being in touch with the poets before him. And I'll end on one final image, which I'm not going to get to, but this is, I mean, I haven't touched upon this question of translation, but this is a poem by Max Czollek that has been translated into Hebrew. Not many of his poems have. It's also a call to any possible translators in the audience. But I really like this translation in particular because I feel there is something in this image, also in the title, Ausschreibung zum Familienfest, Hazmana lechagiga mishpachtit. And then the whole poem is structured by this recurring line of Ich wende mich an diejenigen, die, I turn to those who. And I feel like just seeing the German and the Hebrew in that way, turning to one another, is an image that for me really beautifully encapsulates some of the correspondences that happen between the two languages. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys for really interesting talks, and I'm sorry that we had to hold them to, till we could get all of you together. I had a thought that I want to kind of a question that I wanted to throw out there and also to open it for discussion. But one of the things I think that really struck me listening to all three talks was one, and is really the inability in a sense to tame language. Like even when you're talking about German and Hebrew, we're also talking about Polish and Yiddish. And I was really struck about this in part in sort of in connection to the way that Nama was sharing with us some of the history of the relationships even between German and Hebrew, and the shame, the possible idea of shame involved in maybe writing or publishing publicly in German, or what that might have meant. And there's, of course, for the Polish as well, there are many writers who in the interwar period switched from Polish to either Yiddish or Hebrew. And this kind of comes up again. And what I was curious about is, well, on the one hand, right, like there's a temptation to read this as nomadic, but of course this was the condition of writing in these particular moments. But the idea that much of this is happening in the private world of correspondence and writing and the archive versus what gets publicly published. And Simone, when you were reading that quote from Czollek about this idea that choosing to engage with Hebrew and Yiddish was itself a form of invisibility, I was thinking about that, and I'll just add that all of this made me think a little bit differently about Leah Goldberg's epistolary novel, which is also, about navigating these multiple languages and about the idea of what does it mean to write a private correspondence and publish it, or a public, or actually, keep your correspondence private. So I don't know if you guys want to respond a little bit to that, and then we can open it. Because I think you guys have raised some really interesting questions that have been on my mind.
I mean, maybe I can start by sort of connecting what you just brought up and the point that Maya made, right? That a lot of this work, therefore, kind of because of this, is shaped by the archive, or kind of infected with a kind of archival fever, and what that means. And I think, to me, what I guess this is also more of a question than an answer, but it's precisely sort of the relationship between that and this point that Simone brought up, that that it also lends itself to a kind of forms of reading that discover the other language within one language, right? That this moment where there's a kind of Celan scholarship that turns to the knowledge of the Hebrew, not only around particular Hebrew words that are kind of spelled out by Celan, but with this sort of notion that provides a kind of key, or there are readings of various Hebrew, Pagis has been the target of this quite a bit, but others as well, where sort of the claim that there's a kind of German subtext present within the Hebrew text in puns and in kind of uses of idioms from German, and that you can somehow sort of, that the text is always sort of translated in some sense or another. So it produces these kind of modes of reading. And I think that's one of the interesting things, is precisely to kind of tease out or figure out how all these things relate to each other, and what kind of a cultural history that gives access to.
I'll just add to that, that the historical conditions, I think, that Nama set out in the beginning of of barriers of disconnection and reconnection really encourage that kind of momentum of looking for the language in this languages within each other, or looking for the hidden German, maybe the interlinear German. And also in the poem that Simone showed on Moshava Gilmanit, it's kind of creating this desire for Hebrew in German. So, and I think that that's sort of part of what translation does anyway, is create a desire to know the other language. But when it's not given to you, when he decides to give the Hebrew script and not transliterate, and also in Celan's case, there was kind of a placement of Hebrew words that made you read the poem towards the German poem towards the Hebrew, kind of to look for the Hebrew, to await the Hebrew, as if the Hebrew word would come and kind of solve the situation, or and oftentimes these are words that are incredibly loaded, like ziv or iskol, or things that are just incredibly, every word there seems to be bursting with meaning. But at the same time, I feel a need to resist some of that, and I need to also take into account the politics of the archive, and of why we can't really access some of these correspondences and letters, and why things are still so hard to get to, and why we have to have this kind of secrecy, that the relationship between Hebrew and I'm going on a little long, but I think there's some kind of momentum of seduction and secrecy that these two languages have, that's specific and unique to these two languages. And maybe there's also the sexual politics of Hebrew and Yiddish that Alison is alluding to, but in the German case, there seems to be a lot of a very loaded significance.
Yeah, maybe I can just, I want to really echo what Maya just said, that and Nama said in the beginning with her talk, the importance of the historical context in which the different poems are written, because of course it's really significant for, I think, a poet like Celan, who was living much more in this nomadic position, but then Czollek, this contemporary poet who comes in and wants to resist this constant attribution that he receives as the Jewish German who is somehow aligned in a public imagination with the Wandering Jew, etc. I think the Ahasverlag collection is also really working against this. So we see here a poet that is, I think, really also sort of working against these, at least in a German context, these public fantasies of what Hebrew is. So Hebrew, but Yiddish even more, I would say. So I think that's really significant.
So let's open it up to questions from the audience. Micah, I see you have your hand up.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you. Thank you, Alison, for putting this really interesting group together, and thank you for all the contributions, which I listened to with fascination. I was wondering about, there are maybe 2 points I would like to make. The one is, you emphasize the historical context, in which these poems are written, or when they're debated or translations are debated. I think what we also need to wrap our mind around is that before, in the early 20th century, multilingualism, and I think it's not just being bilingual, but multilingualism is actually the rule and not the exception. I said because it comes across as this is something special. Kafka was at home with Czech, with German, with Yiddish. Celan, Romanian, Yiddish, German, French later on. So if you think of Joseph Roth, but then there is the case of Else Lasker-Schüler, and I think it resonates in your talks. She uses Hebrew words, and I think this is different from inserting Hebrew words into a poem. Like T.S. Eliot does that too, like in the Wasteland, where this German words and Slavic words come up. So she does that. It's different from at Celan who really knew and spoke the languages using them. I think that the universe he moves in is very different. So I think you make these assumptions somewhere in your work, and I think for us to be reminded that this was more the rule before at the beginning of the 20th century is very helpful. Because it seems like it has with us also to do with us as scholars that we rediscover or discover these many languages. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Does anyone want to respond to that, or should we? Why don't we? Nadav has a question, and then you guys, in answering Nadav's question, can also. Nadav.
So first, I want to say thank you so much for these really exciting and thought-provoking talks. I have two possibly related points that I want to present. One is I was really fascinated by the notion of kind of the collapse or the potential collapse of space with translation, that what these translations do or suggest is a kind of not just mediation, but an elimination of space. And we can see that maybe possibly with that image of the Moshava Germanit as a kind of a German enclave within a Hebrew or Israeli space, but also kind of within the correspondences themselves. And the other thing, I think we should really, I think it's fruitful to think more seriously about the epistolary aspect and about the kind of material aspect of the letter as an object that, right, we have this kind of envelope that inside there's a secret, there's something that is related to the kind of body of the writer or the poet, and that sometimes, right, this letter is actually stamped by the nation, right? There's something about the kind of physicality of letter exchange and languages that I think is really fruitful to think about in relation to translation.
I don't know who wants to go first. Yeah, I think the point about the spatial issue of yes, I see the letter as trying, right, as it's kind of crossing the space, trying to arrive elsewhere, while it also, as you said, you know, brings with it all the traces of where it came from, so it can't really attain that. And I'm just interested in how in the poem itself, like in the first translation I showed you guys, Celan keeps inserting like the word fission that doesn't appear that often in Hebrew, or dolt, or constantly like adding terms that really emphasize in the poem itself that he translated that there is distance, that there is physical distance, and that it is important to him to maintain that, to not have a total collapse. So I don't know what, I was also thinking of the previous comment about how important it is, the physicality and the graphic even qualities. Nama talked about Lasker-Schüler's use of painting, drawing, in addition, that the Hebrew letters, and maybe that's also true for Czollek, become symbols and become images. And that's also an important point, I think.
I mean, I can. One thing that I thought about when I heard what Nama and Maya will be doing for this event and looking at letters and correspondences, I mean, that of course made me think, like, is Max Czollek actually writing letters? Probably he's not writing letters. He will be writing emails. He will have moved to a different medium, or maybe even like. These poets, both in Germany but also Israel, they're commenting on their social media posts, etc. So I think the kinds of the conditions of correspondences have really changed, and it's interesting to see how that might have changed the field, because many of the correspondences between someone like Czollek, who's writing in German, but he's also translating from Hebrew. One poet, for instance, that he's been translating is Adi Kesar, but they, of course, they speak English, and much of their correspondence is happening in English. So that's also some of the conditions that I feel like have changed. So adding to, I think Mike is so right, saying that this multilingual condition is, of course, not new. If anything, it was also in Germany or in German literature. It's really more foundational than any kind of like monolingual German writing. But in what ways this has also changed now in a contemporary literary world where many exchanges are happening in English, even if the literature remains in the respective languages.
I guess I can also sort of thinking more about, Mike, about your comment that yes, absolutely, that today as well, right, multilingualism is the norm, and maybe even monolingualism exists only as a kind of ideological pressure or an ideology, rather than even someone who perceives themselves as monolingual kind of is aware of other languages and has to somehow relate to them at certain moments or negate them or right, that multilingualism is always the kind of given against which monolingualism constructs itself. But I would say, right, part of what more recently I've been trying to think through is how these kinds of our assumptions about the cultural interactions of languages, how they work also with various sort of assumptions about what it means, right? What does it mean to know a language and to use it? For example, like in the scholarship on Celan, on the one hand, there is this sort of idea that the Hebrew becomes a kind of key, but there's also this long-standing anxiety, right, about how much Hebrew did he know? Can we say that he knew Hebrew? Right, always kind of this, it's like this something that there's a kind of compulsion to return to, and it comes up in various ways. So the idea of mastery of language, or having it, or in what sense you have the language, and what it means to quote from a language that you don't necessarily fully speak, and that entire dynamic interests me a lot as well. So and with relation to the Hebrew, there's also sort of this, the way that, say, a word like tzimtzum, is it even Hebrew, or does it become a kind of Kabbalistic kind of keyword that can become untied from Hebrew completely? I mean, it's a word that comes up in several interesting places in Hebrew language commentary on Celan, right? So the idea that his poetry has this quality of tzimtzum, and an interesting thing about it is that one way to translate tzimtzum into German is to say Dichtung, right? And that's another kind of that's what it literally means. So that's another layer maybe of Czollek's gesture, perhaps. But I think that's what I've been trying to do, to go back to your comment, Micah, with kind of the givenness or the cultural context of multilingualism is also kind of, it helps us dislocate or dislodge a little bit sort of the notion that of the mother tongue, that poetry comes spontaneously from in the language of the mother tongue, which sometimes comes in these kind of, say, readings of the German presence of certain Hebrew poetry, that it's there as kind of the deep layer of the native language. And I think that the interesting thing is how there's never, right, not to get too Derridian about it, but there isn't an originary language, there isn't a mother language. The condition is always kind of already in translation.
And it's interesting that in 20th century writing in Hebrew, none of these writers were native speakers, just to add to that another layer. So if we talk about, if we talk about Lasker versus Celan, like Lasker's not writing in his native language either. So he's also in some sense already writing in translation and then offering it up in German.
So we have time for more questions. Well, I'll say, I'll give everybody another minute, and it might just be that we've hit our natural conclusion point, that two things that you guys have made me think a lot about is that there's been this backlash about talking about language choice, but it strikes me actually that there's a lot of choice that's being made here about, which I think is really interesting. And the other thing that it makes me think about is this, I think Naomi Simon is writing about this in relationship to Freud, which is the paranoid desire to seek underneath Freud the Yiddish that haunts his work. And what I really appreciate about your guys' approaches is that you're not really working in that idiom of, if we know, like, the Jewish language behind the work, then we have exactly this key. But rather, it's, I think, incredibly interesting what happens when you read, in the case, I think, for Maya and Naama, when you read the letters, when you read the archival documents, sort of what percolates. And then, Simone, I really love what you're saying. It's a crisis of literary studies. What is an author's archive? Like, there aren't letters. It's Facebook posts, Twitter, etc. That perhaps we've lost that space, right? That intellectual linguistic space that's private, where some of this can percolate. So I don't know. You've left me with a lot of really exciting thoughts. So last question. Well, thank you guys so much for coming and for Zooming in, and thanks for a delightful audience. And these are conversations that I think will continue to unfold. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
That's when we have time.
Time, like a time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.